Okay, ladies. Let's wrap up this PowerPoint on introductory evolution, so we can call it that way. So we've been looking at the evidence that suggests life on this planet has evolved, which means has changed over time. And you were supposed to watch a video, What Darwin Never Knew, which the premise of the video is basically it's a history of Darwin, but also it talks about some of the things that Darwin did know, but some of the things that he wasn't aware of, okay? So the following is something that he was not aware of, because the following deals with relatively new information, right? Stuff about genetics, which is way ahead of Darwin's time. Remember, Darwin didn't even know what Mendelian genetics was, let alone molecular genetics. So we're going to talk about how genetics, molecular biology, how that proves that life has changed on this planet, okay? This is actually the last piece, because the sixth one we've already talked about, which I'll show you in a second. So, I said to you that fossil record is nice. It shows you the changes, the transitions, but it's highly imperfect. And I said so you can actually do without it. For me, the most important information that suggests that life has changed on this planet is this. It's the molecular stuff. It's the genetics. It's studying the DNA, the RNA, the protein. This tells us a lot. So we already know that humans and chimps are only about less than 2% different. Right? Over 98% similar. Now, why is that? Because we're related. Why aren't we exactly the same? Because DNA changes over time. There's a simple fact that DNA will change over time because it accumulates something. Glitches. What are the glitches called?
I watched that in the video.
Yeah, mutations, okay? So mutations will happen, and they will accumulate over time. And the idea is, the more closely related you are to something, the less differences there are. The more distantly related, the more differences there are. So we are only 1.6% different from chimps. If you were to look at Neanderthals, we are about 99.1% similar. So there's only like less than 1% difference. We are how much similar relative to each other? 99.9%. So we can use molecular biology to understand how organisms are related to each other, how they've changed, and we'll talk a lot about that in this unit. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we're going to talk about the different examples of genes and how they've changed over time to understand how certain things in evolution have occurred. The genetic code. So, how does it work again? Lauren, you were asking about this. What does RNA do? It gives you protein. And what it does is it actually has to read a code to do that. Okay? Now the code is something that you learn about in grade 12. So you don't really learn about it in grade 11, but I will show it to you if you're curious. This is what it looks like. Okay? This is the code that gives you life. Okay? And basically the letter so these here are these are the amino acids that make up protein. So hemoglobin would just be a combination of these things. Okay? And the information to make the hemoglobin is in the DNA, which is encoded here. Okay? So this code gives you this amino acid. This code gives you this amino acid. So your DNA is like a recipe, and it's read, and it's translated into RNA, transcribed into RNA, You'll get more what that means next year. And then it's converted into protein. This code that I'm showing you virtually is usable by all living things. So whether it's a human, a raccoon, or a bacteria, they use the same code. You could take a gene from a human that makes insulin, you can plug it into bacteria, and they will make the exact same protein because they're using the exact same language that you're using, or that I'm using. The fact that all living things, virtually all, which means there are some exceptions, but virtually all living things use this code, this system, this series of alphabets to give you a protein, tells us something important. Tells us that we're all connected. Otherwise, you wouldn't expect that. Okay? You wouldn't expect that at all. Now, going back to this simple idea of if two things are more like each other, there are less differences, then we can look at a protein and we can analyze it. And we'll be doing this. Not today, but we'll be doing this. Examples of looking at proteins and genes, scanning them, looking at similarities and differences, and reconstructing family trees. It's very easy. I'll show you how to do it later on in this course. Okay? And again, the idea is simple. Two things are more similar, less differences. Two things are more different, more differences. So here's a protein. This protein is cytochrome C. It's a special protein involved in cellular respiration, which you'll learn about in grade 12. One of the things you learn about in grade 12. Okay? And what this is a little chart showing you how many differences there are between humans and another organism. So like, for example, humans and monkeys are, this is your scale. This is the number of, you can call them mutations if you like, because they are. Okay? So between humans and monkeys, there are about 2. I don't know what the number is, but it looks like it's about maybe 2 differences. Between humans and pigs, it's closer to 10. So if I just go across here, it looks like it's closer to 10. If I look at humans and fish, it's closer to 20. If I look at humans and moths, it looks closer to 30. If I look at humans and fungi, it's closer to 50. Now, how do you, remember I said that quote that, things in biology do not make sense unless you look at their evolutionary history, right? Why does, if you look at the evolutionary history of these organisms, this makes sense. Otherwise it wouldn't. If we didn't know anything about their history, this pattern wouldn't make any sense to us. But we do know something. You know that humans and monkeys are what? Primates. And they're very similar to each other. So because of that history, we know that we expect to find little difference between humans and monkeys. We know that humans, monkeys, and pigs are what? Mammals. And ducks are not mammals. So we're more like pigs than pigs are like ducks. Because we're mammals just like pigs are. So our evolutionary history is, well, we had common mammal ancestor with pigs. Ducks aren't pigs. They're birds. They're more different. So we expect less difference between humans and pigs. And more difference between humans and ducks. And that's what you're seeing here. But if you didn't know the evolutionary history, this would be like nonsense to you. It wouldn't make any sense. Why are humans more like ducks, or ducks more like humans? Why are turtles and ducks more different than humans and ducks? Yep. So do turtles. So do turtles. Land? Well, whales live in the water. There's a group that we belong to, that ducks belong to, that, I'm sorry, I wanted you to look at something else. I'm sorry, I was I thought this was something. Can I change this to turtle? Because the turtle one's actually hard to explain. I'm going to change to frog. Okay? Okay. Can I change this to frog? That one's a bit easier to explain. Okay? So I'm going to change this to a frog. No, I'm just going to write the word frog because the characteristics that you guys just used.
What kind of an R is that?
It's a pretty good R. The characteristics that you guys just used to describe turtles would apply to frogs, right? Has legs, lives in the water, whatever. So same thing, okay? The turtle one's a little bit harder to explain, but the frog one's a little bit easier. What do you think we have in common with ducks that frogs don't have? Because this is actually a very important characteristic, and you see it in we're going to be watching a whole series called Your Inner Fish, which is an amazing series, okay? And they talk about this characteristic. Now, I know ducks are more distant related, but I can be honest with you, I can't remember the exact characteristic. So that's why I wanted to change this to a frog. So I'm cheating a little bit. But what is it that frogs don't have that turtles have? Yep. Okay. That's great. I'm glad you mentioned that. Ducks are warm-blooded. Humans are warm-blooded. But that is an example of convergent evolution. You know what that means? That means two things evolve independently. So you might think they're related because they have something in common, but they just independently evolved in like wings between butterflies and birds, okay? We belong to a group called the amniotes. Now the amniotes, okay, are animals that lay eggs with shells. An amniotic egg is a shelled egg that has this membrane called the amniote around it. It's got these amniotic membranes that prevent the egg from drying out. Now, we're also amniotes. Now, we don't lay shelled eggs, but you'll see in the video on the inner fish that the way, what we make in terms of an egg is very similar to what ducks do. Very similar. Frogs don't lay waterproof eggs. That's what an amniotic egg is a waterproof egg. Now, our egg happens to be internal, not for males, for females, right? But frogs do not have that characteristic. A frog has to lay its eggs where? In the water, okay? Ducks don't. So we belong to a group called the amniotes. So again, because we belong to this group, we should expect to see more similarities between us and the duck. Now, fish. Well, what don't fish have? Claudia, you mentioned this. Fish don't have what? They don't have legs. So these organisms here, from here to here, they belong to a group called tetrapods. They're four-limbed animals. Okay? Four-limbed animals. Even snakes would be in this group. So, because we're all connected to a tetrapod ancestor, and frogs are not, then we should be more like each other. And you see that. Humans and turtles are more like each other than humans are with fish. What about the last two? Why are humans more like moths? But not this thing. What's this thing? I don't know what this is. It's a fungus. What do we have in common with moths? What are we? Starts with an A. Ends in mammals. Animals. Very good. So we expect animals to be more like each other than things that are not animals. And that's what you see. So the molecular biology shows us a lot. We'll talk more about this as we go on in this unit, okay? Here's just another one. This is with a different protein. This is hemoglobin. Same logic. Humans and monkey are the most similar. Humans and mice next, because these three are what? Mammals. Your amniote is here. it's more like us than we are like frogs. And then this thing, this is a lamprey. Why is it more different? Well, you might say, I can't tell from this picture, but this does not have any jaws. Jaws is actually an important characteristic. All these representatives up here are jawed animals. They have animals with jaws that can open and close. So we expect that because we're all connected to a jawed ancestor, that we're more like each other. And anything that doesn't have jaws should be more different. The molecular biology tells us that things that we think are really different sometimes are very similar. According to this chart, the closest living relative to whales and dolphins are hippos. You'll be studying this. This is called a phylogenetic tree. This is like a family tree. And the way you read is quite easy. You look, so it looks like a tree. These are branch points. So here's a branch point, here's a branch point, here's a branch point, here's a branch point. Now this branch point gives rise to this thing, this, and this. Because you can see all four of these things are connected by this point. See these three things here? 1, 2, 3. They're all connected through this point. See these two over here? They're connected by this point. The higher up you go, the more you are like each other. So because hippos and whales are connected by a very high branch point, very similar to each other. Now you would think, a hippo and a cow, man, they look like each other. Very similar compared to a whale, but the molecular biology says whales and hippos are very closely related. Very closely related. Again, you'll be studying more of these later on. Okay. We'll skip over this. We don't need to worry about this. And then we talked about what's known as the sixth piece of evidence. We talked about artificial selection. We talked about this just shows us that populations have extreme what? Variety. And we can generate a lot of change. And that's what evolution is. I need you to think of evolution as something that is very simple. I always call it a very simple theory. Because all you need are three things. You need variation. You need selection. And you need time. You need variety that you can inherit. You need something to weed out or pick things. Now, in this case, who was doing the picking here? Who was doing the picking for kohlrabi and kale? Humans. And what kind of selection is that? That's artificial. But if it's the environment, it's called natural selection. If it's generated by reproduction, we have another name for it. It's called sexual selection. And we'll talk about that one later on. Okay? So all you need to generate change, this is what you see here, change, okay? You need variety that you can inherit. You need selection, something that will favor one thing versus another, and you need time. In the example, going back to the example with the giraffe, you have a population variety of individuals who have longer necks, some will have shorter. The selection was the environment. If you can get more food with a longer neck, you would have an advantage. And over time, what did you find? Longer neck giraffes, because they had more babies. Okay? How do we apply that idea to this, to antibiotic resistance? Okay, so there's a growing problem with bacteria. in that they can acquire what's known as antibiotic resistance. And the idea behind antibiotic resistance is very similar. If you just apply the VST, you start with a population of bacteria, and any bacteria that has an advantage in that maybe it's immune to an antibiotic will be selected for in the presence of the antibiotic. So let me explain that. Let's imagine we have two types of bacteria. Okay? I'm going to call them antibiotic negative and antibiotic positive. This is the one that's resistant. So I'm going to color it in. So this one's resistant. Okay? So this one's resistant to antibiotic. We'll call it, maybe it's like penicillin. Maybe it's resistant to penicillin. But this one over here is not. Okay? Who has the advantage? Depends. I didn't tell you what the environment looked like. If the environment does not have the antibiotic, the actual advantage goes to this guy. Because this bacteria would probably be carrying extra gene or genes to protect itself. I need you to think of extra genes like a fur coat. Okay? Now, if I said to you, is there an advantage in having a fur coat? What would you say? Depends. Would you want to be lugging around a fur coat in the desert? No. In fact, in that case, would you even want the fur coat? No, you would give it away. Why would you give it away? Because you got to carry it. Even if you don't have to wear it, you got to what? You got to carry it. So, what is advantageous depends on the environment. If I have a patient and I have a bacteria in the population that is resistant, maybe it's carrying an extra gene or two to protect itself from the antibiotic. And now I apply the antibiotic. What happens? All of the competitors get eliminated. Who survives? The resistant form. What happens then? When the resistant form makes a copy of itself, guess what the daughter cell has? Resistant. Now what you end up with is with a population of resistant bacteria when the antibiotic is present. Okay? So antibiotic resistance is a neat modern day example of Darwinian evolution in action. What about fish? Let's see if we can apply this idea of variation, selection, and time. What would you rather be? A big fish or a little fish? It depends. Now, take away humans, I probably would rather be the big fish. But when people go fishing and they use nets, there is a selection pressure to be small. Because what happens? The net has a certain size. If you're small, you can get through the net. But if you're big, you get caught. So the selective advantage goes to the smaller fish. So over time, if we say we have variety, we have small fish, big fish, and the smaller fish have an advantage, what happens? And this is what's been noted. Fishermen are reporting that the average size of fish decreases because we're weeding out the bigger one. Okay? Weeding out the bigger ones. Here's another one. This is a classic example. Which moth would you rather be? Dark or light one? Depends. And here's a little thing. I want you to understand one thing. You always want to be better than who you're competing with. That's generally the idea, right? Like, if I ask you a question about when you're running away from a bear. By the way, you never should run away from a bear because they'll cut you. But then, what do you do anyways? You got to do something. If I said to you, how fast you need to be to run up from a bear? I would tell you this one. Faster than the person beside you. Then you're in trouble. Then you're in trouble. All right. So here, two types of moths. this is and we'll be studying this when we get to a section called Hardy-Weinberg. We're going to go back to genetics, and we're going to do some math with genetics. Yay! Yeah. And the coloration for that moth, and here's the name of the moth, okay? Biston Beetularia, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Determined by simple genetics. It's one gene, two versions. The dominant is dark, the recessive is light. So this is the frequency of the dark allele. And since the 50s, the dark allele has actually dropped, which means that the other one is going up. If one allele is going down, like think of it as the allele like heads and tails, right? If the frequency of heads is going up, I'm getting more heads, that means the frequency of tails must be going down. So this is telling us that currently, according to this data, that the white moth is actually doing better. But, you ever heard of the Industrial Revolution? Okay. So, one big problem that came out of the Industrial Revolution is pollution. A lot of the trees in England started to become really dark because of the pollution. What happened during the Industrial Revolution is that these moths started to grow in frequency because the trees got really dark. But since the 50s, they've been passing all of these laws to clean up the environment. So now the trees have gotten lighter again. And you can see the obvious advantage here, right? What's the advantage of the white moth on the white tree? Okay, what's the advantage here? So what's the problem? If you're a white moth on the black tree, easily spotted. If you're a dark moth on a white tree, easily spotted. So you apply the, simple theory, right? If the white moth has a selective disadvantage, over time you see a rise in the black moth. Okay? Very, very, very simple idea. Okay? So why don't we stop there, and we'll call it a wrap. The end.